In an interview with Derek from Mythvision, the biblical scholar James Tabor describes how Paul misuses a Hebrew scripture regarding God's promises to Abram and his seed or offspring. In fact, Tabor finds Paul's argument laughable, since it's based on an erroneous misunderstanding of a presumed difference between the singular and plural forms of the Hebrew word for offspring. We'll listen to Dr. Tabor first, and then I'll respond.
He says if somebody makes a will or a covenant, like with Abraham, God made a covenant, and he said, to your seed, through your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And he says, it does not say to your offsprings, seeds, referring to many, but referring to one. Well, in Hebrew, zarah is seed, singular, but it's also plural, and we use it that way in English. Someone spills their seed on the ground. Remember the famous Onan story? What did he spill? One sperm? Spilled his seed. It's a uniplural word. You know, we have plenty of words like that where they're singular, but they mean plural according to context. But he says it doesn't mean plural. It means one, and your offspring, which is Christ. Again, if I go back to Genesis 12, and it's repeated a couple times, I give you the land, go from your country, and so forth. And in your seed, I'll make of you a great nation. That's plural. Not I'm going to bring you a guy someday named Jesus. I'll make of you a great nation. And through your offspring, and remember, when he's given that, he doesn't have all these kids yet, right? It's the kid of promise. And so he says it's offspring, not offsprings. And it really means Jesus. Well, nobody could read Genesis 12, first few verses, 1 through 3. That's the fundamental promise of Abrahamic faith. Great nation, the land, blessings to the world. It cannot mean through one guy someday. It's not messianic. It's not messianic. So he's taking that, and I don't know, in Greek you can make it plural. So it's not offsprings, it's offspring, but if you go to Hebrew, clearly seed. And Isaac is told that, and Jacob, in your seed, what, like one guy? No, your offspring, your offspring. Yeah. But notice in Galatians when he says, if you are Christ, you're Abraham's seed.
Yes. That
should be singular according to him, and now he means it's plural. You're Abraham's seed. You're not Christ. You're Abraham's seed, plural. So here he contradicts. He says seed is plural, not singular. I mean, seed is singular, not plural.
Right.
And then when he quotes it, all of a sudden it becomes you and me, and it's plural.
So did Paul, a devout Pharisee, trained under the prestigious Rabbi Gamaliel, really not know that the word seed or offspring, zera in Hebrew, was a collective noun? Ironically, Tabor himself points out that in the paragraph after his discussion of singular and plural in Galatians 3:16, Paul uses the same word, offspring, as a collective noun. And if you are Christ, then you are Abram's offspring, heirs according to the promise. Although Tabor didn't seem to know that Greek is the same in this respect, Paul obviously does, for he didn't write offsprings, plural, heirs according to promise, but offspring, heirs according to the promise. So we aren't left to guess whether Paul knew the word in the singular was often a collective noun. The only question is whether we have understood Paul's argument about the singular meaning of offspring in Galatians 3:16. Most scholars conclude that Paul knows the grammar, but is using a rabbinical style of argument in which the original meaning of the grammar can be set aside in order to draw a higher spiritual lesson. But Tabor also fails to mention that the word offspring, zera in the singular form, can also have a singular meaning, as in Genesis 21:13. He is your offspring. So the word can be a collective noun or can refer to a singular offspring or child. But are scholars correct that Paul knew the grammar, but was making a rabbinical argument that by today's standards wouldn't be persuasive to most people? In order to grasp Paul's argument about the offspring, we need to trace his progression of thought in its immediate context. Only then can we decide whether he doesn't know the grammar, knows the grammar and is using a rabbinical form of argument, or there's some third option. The context is that some of Paul's opponents argue that even if Genesis 15:6, Abraham believed God and it was counted to him for righteousness, teaches that Abram was justified by faith, many years after Abram's justification by faith, God gave Israel the law according to the book of Exodus. But as anyone can see from the Pentateuch, God gave Israel the law before they entered into their inheritance in Joshua. God did this, Paul's opponents asserted, because God was teaching Israel that their keeping of the law's commands was an added condition for their entrance into the inheritance. Without keeping the law's commands, they would not be permitted to enter into their inheritance. Justification by faith was only half of their salvation. Works of the law would guarantee their inheritance. Paul responds to this line of thinking in Galatians 3:15-19. His reply centers on the second half of Genesis 15. So let's read the exact language of Genesis 15. And Abram said to God, "Look, you have not given me a descendant, Zerah, and here a member of my household is my heir. And behold, the word of Yahweh came to him, saying, This person, singular, will not be your heir, but your own son, singular, will be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, Look toward the heavens, and count the stars, if you are able to count them. And he said to him, So shall your offspring, Zerah, be. And he believed in Yahweh, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness." You can see quite clearly that God and Abram's discussion is about who will be Abram's direct heir, and therefore the heir of God's promises. It's also clear God promises Abram that he will father a singular son. Eventually, that singular heir would become as the innumerable stars. So the singular heir, Isaac, contained the plurality of heirs, Israel, within him. Abram then asks, "How am I to know that I shall possess the land?" That is, Abram wants assurance that the promise of the land to him and his offspring is guaranteed. And God responds by establishing a covenant or contract with Abram in Genesis 15, verses 12 to 21. More importantly, the way in which God ratifies the covenant reveals that the fulfillment of the contract involves conditions that only God has to fulfill, for he walks alone through the divided sacrifices and not with Abram, which was the normal custom where both parties had obligations to fulfill. Abram and his offspring have no terms to fulfill except to believe God. Therefore, the guarantee of the inheritance is based exclusively upon God's promise and his covenant ratifying that he himself will fulfill that promise. This is why Paul argues in Galatians 3. Even with a man-made covenant, no one annuls it or adds to it once it has been ratified. The law, which came 430 years afterward, does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God, so as to make the promise void. For if the inheritance comes by the law, it no longer comes by promise, but God gave it to Abraham by promise. Paul's crucial observation is that in Genesis 15, when Abram requested a guarantee of his inheritance, God did not give him the law on that occasion and demand he keep the commandments. Rather, he secured the inheritance through a covenant ratifying the promise. So the law given 400 years later can't be properly viewed as an added condition for securing their inheritance. With that settled, we can now weigh his point about the singular offspring. He says, "Now to Abraham were spoken the promises, and to his offspring." And it doesn't mean, "and to his offsprings," as if to many, but "to your offspring," as if to one. His comment is directly related to his analysis of Genesis 15, regarding the guarantee of the inheritance, and he is emphasizing what is plain for all to see, that in Genesis 15, the original heir of Abram was spoken of explicitly as a singular descendant. That singular offspring would eventually become as the stars. So there's nothing ridiculous about Paul's observation of the plain meaning of the wording of Genesis 15, or of the reiteration of this promise in subsequent chapters. And as for Paul's assertion that this singular offspring in Genesis 15 was Messiah, we have to listen to his exact language. For he says that centuries later the law was added because of transgressions, until the offspring should come to whom the promise had been made. He's obviously not ignorant to the fact that Isaac was the original son of Abram, to whom the promise initially passed, just as it passed to Isaac's son Jacob, and so on. The promise was like a baton that passes through a relay until the last runner should come, who reaches the finish line. Indeed, God informed Abraham that the promise would eventually pass to kings among his descendants. Kings shall come from you. And still within Genesis, Jacob declared that these kings would come from the tribe of Judah. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. 2 Samuel records how the promise eventually passed to David and his son. But Paul understandably correlated all these grand promises to Abraham and his family with God's prior and original promise of a singular human offspring who would crush the head of the serpent and thereby deliver humanity. Paul refers to this original promise in Romans 16. Such persons, by smooth talk and flattery, deceive the hearts of the naive. The God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. This original singular restorer of humanity, spoken of in Genesis 3:15, was intended from the beginning to be, so to speak, the last runner. All that God did with Israel was only until the offspring should come to whom the promise had been made. God could, of course, have given directly to Abram the 12 children of the 12 tribes and skipped the singular heir Isaac. But instead, he chose to give Abram just one child as the direct heir of his promises. At that stage of history, all the heirs of the promise were, so to speak, physically in Isaac. There were no heirs outside of Isaac. But as Paul writes these observations, he's confident that Jesus has been demonstrated to be Messiah, and that all who believe in him are the true heirs of the promise. And just as all those who were in Isaac physically were heirs of the promises, provided they believed God as Abram did, so also all those who are in Messiah spiritually, through faith and the baptism of the Spirit, are now also heirs of the promises. You don't have to agree with Paul's conclusions about Jesus as Messiah to see that his argument from Genesis 15 isn't a ridiculous misunderstanding of the grammar of the word seed, zera. In conclusion, Paul is neither ignorant that the word offspring can be a collective noun, nor is he making a rabbinical argument where the plain meaning of the original grammar is irrelevant. In fact, by the way, the few references to singular and plural distinctions in early Jewish writings are examples of interpreting the grammar literally, not figuratively anyway. Paul highlights the plain meaning of the language of Genesis 15 as his starting point and asserts that the singular restorer of humanity, Messiah, first promised in Genesis 3:15 as the one who would bruise the serpent's head, had always been intended as the primary recipient of God's promises to humanity and to Abraham's family. That these Genesis promises are correlated is a natural reading of the plot development, but that would take another video to demonstrate. So what do you think? Let me know in the comments section below, and I'll try to respond to substantive comments.